Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Amped It Up. I'm your host, Sarah Beth Becker, and my pronouns are she, her. This episode took a lot longer than I wanted it to, not because it's particularly long or difficult, but because I spent all of June out doing research. I wrote about half of the script during that time and ultimately just didn't have enough free time to get it done. However, it's done now, and really that's what's important here. So, what are we talking about today? Well, last episode, I mentioned medicalization at the end as something I wanted to talk about, especially since it was sort of referenced in the pilot but never fully explained. So that's the topic for today: medicalization, the good, the bad, and the ambiguous. The ways in which it's used when talking about a variety of social issues, including, of course, trans health, but also addiction, gun violence, childbirth, infertility and impotence, and even cancer. No fancy introduction to set the stage this time. The context I'm working in will be pretty obvious as I move through the topic, so let's get started. First, what is medicalization? I.K. Zola defines medicalization as the process whereby more and more of everyday life has come under medical dominion, influence, and supervision. Medicalization, then, is when things that weren't considered medical issues become medical issues. This definition isn't bad. Its emphasis on the ways that everyday life becomes subsumed by the medical field provides a useful framework for understanding the phenomenon. It is, however, vague about how medicalization actually happens. Peter Conrad provides a tighter definition, saying that medicalization is the act of defining behavior as a medical problem or illness and mandating or licensing the medical professional to provide some kind of treatment for it. His definition emphasizes the way that medicalization is done by laying out both the types of solutions that are appropriate for solving a problem, as well as who is qualified to administer those solutions, usually medical professionals. Taken together, those definitions illustrate both the expanding scope of medicalization and how it works. Conrad goes a step further, though, and describes medicalization as a form of social control, listing 3 ways it can happen. First is conceptual. Medical vocabulary is used, but no/few medical professionals are involved, and little to no treatment is applied. An example of this is alcoholism as a disease. While society views alcoholism as a disease, there are basically no medical treatments administered by doctors for it. It's medicalization in concept only. This isn't to say that conceptual medicalization is useless or pointless, just that this is the weakest form. The second level is institutional. Organizations take a medical approach to dealing with problems with physicians acting as gatekeepers to external, non-physician managed solutions. A good example of this is pediatric development. General practice pediatricians have medicalized the development of infants and toddlers with key milestones that the children should be reaching. If a child doesn't reach a milestone in a standard time frame, the pediatrician might refer the parents to therapy or other exercises for the child. The problem is medical, but the role of the doctor is just to point to non-medical treatments. The final level is interactional. Here, doctor-patient interactions are prominent. A medical diagnosis is given, and a medical treatment is prescribed. This is the strongest form of medicalization. Erectile dysfunction is the most common example. Impotence was given a clinical definition and is now diagnosed by doctors who can prescribe a medication to fix it. Now, none of these categories are mutually exclusive. In fact, the opposite is true. Often 2 or more will be present at once, working together to form the medicalization of a given issue. Distinguishing between them, however, allows for a better understanding of how medicalization works and how it might be undone, if that's the goal. Because medicalization is not a value-neutral process. Far from it, it has just as many moral connotations and implications in it as any other framework for understanding parts of the world. Medicalization, as it's often used, refers to over-medicalization or inappropriate medicalization. It's usually negative, at least in anthropology. However, it doesn't have to be, nor should it always be. Medicalization also isn't a static process or a one-time event. It's continually reinforced and reenacted through patient-physician interactions, guidelines from medical organizations, and laws. Also, those 3 types I listed aren't the only ways that medicalization can happen. Increasingly, the power in medical contexts has been taken away from the doctor as a weakly paternalistic figure and placed in the hands of insurance agencies, pharmaceutical companies, and individual patients. Instead of the physician deciding what a medical issue is and what the treatment should be, insurance companies dictate both through what they elect to cover and for whom they elect to cover it. Pharmaceutical companies have gained unprecedented power through the introduction of direct-to-consumer marketing, medicalizing what might otherwise be considered aspects of everyday life to sell more pills. Erectile dysfunction is the absolute classic example of this. Regardless of what's causing the impotence, be it a recognized medical disorder or just a general inability to get it up, erectile dysfunction was marketed to consumers through ads as a legitimate medical problem that both can and should be treated with medication. A very profitable medication, no less. But it's not just ads. Individual patients use their insurance coverages, pharmaceutical advertisements, and potentially dubious medical information on the internet to self-diagnose. They may then seek treatment from a doctor for that self-diagnosis. But self-diagnosed or not, can often hit a dead end in treatment due to insurance companies refusing to cover certain procedures. In this way, doctors don't disappear from the equation entirely, but their importance is lessened. These new factors, taken together, act through what Conrad and Valerie Leader call mediated and private medical markets. Mediated markets concern procedures covered by insurance. Private markets concern those that are not. As I mentioned earlier, they give the example of Viagra as a treatment for erectile dysfunction. Impotence is medicalized both through a mediated market, where the prescription is covered by insurers, and through a private market, where men buy the pills without insurance or even a prescription. To account for the way that insurance policies, marketing, and patient agency now drive medicalization, I think it's worth adding a new category to Conrad's levels of medicalization. This new level, economical, is specifically concerned with how medicalization works through both mediated and free markets in sometimes contradictory ways. Like the previous three levels, it's not exclusive and pretty much always happens alongside them. Okay, that's your crash course on what medicalization is. It's the process by which something becomes thought of as a medical issue and has varying degrees of how medical it's considered to be and the ways in which it can be treated as a medical issue. Now, I want to get into some more specific examples to weigh the pros and cons of medicalization. I mentioned earlier that in anthropology, it usually has a negative connotation, and we'll return to that after I go through these examples, but it should be pretty apparent why. However, I want to be clear that just because it's often negative doesn't mean that it always should be. Just something to keep in mind. I'll try to do my due diligence. So we've already talked about erectile dysfunction a bit, and I'm going to keep talking about it because it's a really, really good example. Because not only does the term erectile dysfunction medicalize impotence just by existing, but it also medicalizes masculinity itself. First, the medicalization of impotence is often discussed as negative because it does two harmful things. One, it convinces people who are basically otherwise healthy and might have a non-biological cause for their bedroom difficulties that they are sick or defective and need a pretty expensive treatment. Expensive, relatively speaking, on a per-pill basis. Two, it enforces a very specific and narrow definition of male health. It emphasizes sexual performance in the context of heterosexual, potentially procreative, penetrative sex. It turns the penis into a phallus, a social and medical ideal of masculinity. To have a phallus, to be capable of reproductive sex, therefore, is to be a man. And if you don't have a phallus, you aren't a man. I'm not reaching here either. Impotence is specifically presented as a male health issue. And while this is kind of fine in the sense that men are the people who most often have trouble with a lower member, they aren't the only ones who can, and this isn't reflected in the advertising or the treatments. The implications are there, and they help form a biological and medical definition of what it is to be a man. Femininity is no different. Take pregnancy and childbirth, for example. Now, I've already gone over why it's problematic and flat out wrong to define womanhood in terms of giving birth or some vague notion of a body intended to give birth. That was last episode. Give it a listen if you haven't. A vocab word for you here, plus a brief tangent. That latter statement I made, a body intended to give birth, is a teleology, or a definition that is based on what something is intended to do rather than how it came to be. The reason a teleological explanation is wrong here is because biology doesn't have intentions. Your DNA did not set out to deliberately create a body that is capable of birthing a child or providing the genetic material necessary to give birth to a child. Natural selection didn't do that on purpose either. It's not some mysterious force that was specifically picking the best forms of an organism to survive and pass on their genes. This is hard for people to understand, and I get why. We're used to things having a purpose, to things being designed by someone. The more complicated something is, the more likely it feels like it should have been designed that way. And narratives of creation in Christianity have definitely made this more complicated because a lot of people do believe in some form of creationism or another, at least in America. If not outright creationism, then maybe intelligent design. For them, the teleological explanation is a no-brainer. It appears objectively correct. Now, I'm not going to engage with the outright creationist viewpoint here because that's just outside the scope of what I want to talk about today. I would need like an entire series to get through that. For now, hopefully you can understand that even if something serves an important function, that function is not necessarily the reason that thing exists in the first place. In the case of human sex, while the ability to become pregnant and give birth are very important for the continuation of the species, they arose through random chance over time by the accumulation of millions and millions of mutations that happen to be beneficial, not by deliberate design. If you want to believe that God helped guide those mutations, fine, I guess, but you should still recognize that this kind of influence would appear indistinguishable from random chance to scientists, given that scientists overwhelmingly have not seen this kind of guidance in the data, and there's therefore no reason to consider teleological explanations for bodily forms when you're doing science. And we are doing science here. Okay, tangent over, enjoy your new vocab word. Back to femininity and childbirth. Here's a question for you. Why do people give birth in hospitals with doctors present? It seems like a no-brainer. Being pregnant is a medical condition and that it causes risks to a person's health, especially during the process of giving birth, making it the domain of medicine and doctors. But it wasn't always this way. Prior to the 1800s, childbearing was the domain of midwives and other people like them. But the 1800s were a time of great change, one of those being the increasing professionalization of medicine. Male doctors specializing in childbirth had a problem. Their services offered much higher mortality rates than that of midwives due to the, frankly, abysmal conditions in hospitals at the time. However, they very much wanted to be respected as legitimate professionals, especially because the alternative was a profession full of women. Their solution? Make the conversation about abortion. These doctors began to publicly speak about the evils of abortion, professing the importance of the life of the fetus above all else, and condemning midwives for not condemning abortion. Their professed moral superiority translated into perceived professional superiority, and this worked. It worked extremely well. Childbirth in hospitals became more common, and midwife-assisted births less so. Rather than a stage in a person's life that could be more or less dangerous, pregnancy became viewed as a medical condition with the health and safety of the, quote, newly discovered second patient at its center. That's right. Medicalized pregnancy is not primarily about the health of the pregnant person. It prioritizes the health of the fetus. Now, women are the people who most often get pregnant and give birth. Until recently, in fact, there was very little recognition that anyone other than women could do so, both in popular culture and in medicine. Pregnancy was very much a woman's health issue. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. Decreasing the mortality rate in childbirth is objectively a good thing and might be worth the baggage that comes with treating pregnancy as a medical condition. But that's not why pregnancy was medicalized, was it? No, it was always about the life of the unborn fetus first and foremost. And when an issue explicitly framed as a woman's health issue is explicitly about the superior value of someone or something else, well, then women are being defined by their relationship to that something else. And this isn't something that went away with time either. The 2021 draft of the World Health Organization's Global Action Plan on Alcohol, that's a mouthful, argued that anti-alcohol campaigns should target women of childbearing age because of the health risks to fetuses associated with alcohol consumption during pregnancy. No similar recommendations were made to men, despite male alcohol consumption before fertilization also carrying risks for fetus. As an aside, I found out about this plan announcement thing while I was on vacation in Vegas with my family. I remember very clearly being at the Nacho Daddies on the Strip, reading an article about it, and then drinking way more than I originally intended to out of spite. Anyways, in this recommendation, a woman's body is not her own. It belongs to any potential fetus that might one day take up residence in her womb. The recommendation also specifically targeted women, not people with wombs or even people with fertile wombs, despite there being a substantial difference. Women, therefore, are medicalized as baby making machines. And just like with men, where if you're not in possession of the ideal phallus, then you are truly not a man, an inability or unwillingness to give birth makes you less of a woman. It should be pretty obvious why I picked these two examples. I'm the gender person. I will never escape this. The role of medicalization in modern understandings of gender is the whole reason I'm even talking about this topic. But I promise to look at both pros and cons here, and I'll be honest, so far, I've mostly given cons. So here are some pros. In the case of erectile dysfunction, making it something that is recognized and talked about publicly can help alleviate the stigma that people with performance issues might feel in isolation. While erectile dysfunction does tie manhood to sexual performance, it also presents ED as a fixable problem, not a death sentence to masculinity. Childbirth, too, benefits some from being seen as a medical condition. For one, even though the health of the fetus might be prioritized more or less secretly, the increased attention to the pregnant person's health can help lower mortality rates and catch complications early. It's also helpful from the perspective of rights in the workplace as it helps prevent discrimination. Employers, theoretically, aren't allowed to discriminate on the basis of a medical condition. You might have guessed from the ways that I've talked about this whole topic, but I personally don't find these pros, pro enough to justify the accompanying cons. In the case of ED, focusing on performance issues as a biological malfunction obscures the way that these things are often caused by interpersonal or psychological conflict and distress. The drugs are a band-aid to larger issues. Childbirth as a medical issue has the same problem. The shift in focus to the measurable health of the pregnant person as the main concern in pregnancy and childbirth distracts from the fact that living through giving birth is only one small part of the entire process. Equally important are the parents' ability to support their new child and themselves, have a safe place to stay, stable employment, and even time off to care for their infant. But since the concern is mainly on the infant being safely born, these problems fade into the background. Bit of a change of pace here. James Ferguson is an anthropologist who's written extensively on economics and politics. One of his most famous works is the book The Anti-Politics Machine, in which he dismantles the idea of international development of so-called third world countries as something that is positive for those countries. It's a very interesting book. I recommend it. He argues that the idea of development is deployed, as the title indicates, as an anti-politics machine, to mask efforts to economically and politically control those countries for the benefit of first world countries. Development itself is supposedly apolitical, a humanistic effort to improve the lives of fellow humans who are, for some mysterious and unspecified reason, struggling to attain a supposed ideal modern standard of life. But these development projects pretty much always fail, and yet, that doesn't stop more from happening or even cause those projects to be regarded as failures. No, the material failure of the project's stated goals is irrelevant because the unstated goal, to influence and gain some measure of control, both direct and indirect, over the target area, was a success. The political goal enacted through an apolitical machine. Do you ever think about the way that we as a society treat alcoholism? It used to be seen as a moral failing that was sort of the whole reason for prohibition in the first place, and to be fair, it still is in some ways. But there's another way that people talk about alcoholism now. I mentioned it earlier. It's as a medical condition. Alcohol use disorder is a medicalized form of alcoholism, specifically in that first sense I mentioned, where things are talked about in medical terms, but explicit treatment is not as common as non-medical treatments. Why do we talk about alcoholism as a medical condition, though? On the one hand, it's useful for destigmatizing addiction, a disease which by its nature is treatable instead of a moral failing. There's some good scientific evidence to back that up too, and that's important. Destigmatization can be crucial in getting people to acknowledge they need help. But there's another reason that medicalizing addiction is useful. Medical conditions are a problem of the individual, not society. The cure, likewise, is largely individualized. By making addiction a medical problem, the possibility of addressing its social causes decreases. Those social causes including things like discontent, poverty, isolation, and abuse. For better and for worse, medicalization is a sort of anti-politics machine, especially in America, where the idea of mixing up politics with medicine is so repulsive to part of the public that they refuse to even consider the idea of a universal public option for healthcare. When something becomes a medical issue, it's implied to not be a political one. Here's another example. In the book Fatal Invention, Dorothy Roberts looks at how race is being recreated in the modern era through the misuse of DNA. I don't think I've said this yet on my podcast, so just to be clear, race is, and always has been, a social classification, not a biological one. Races are not biologically real. In fact, two black people randomly picked off the street are likely to be significantly more genetically different from each other than they are from a random white person picked off the street. Skin color just doesn't correlate with biology or genetic patterns that way. Race has biological implications in the sense that discrimination has negative effects on people's health and their bodies, but those negative effects are caused by social factors, not inherent biological ones. The reason I bring this up is because in the book, Roberts essentially argues that race is depoliticized through the misapplication of genetics, confusing geographic ancestry with historical racial categories. This practice is especially pernicious in medicine, continuing a long history of discriminatory treatment against minority races on the basis of biological difference from white people. And, in the process, race is medicalized. Doctors can say, it's not discrimination, medically speaking, black people are just, more likely to get heart disease and don't respond well to such and such treatment. Suddenly, the material causes of increased rates of heart disease, including minority stress, being more likely to live in a polluted environment due to poverty, limited access to affordable, healthy food, and even epigenetic influences from previous generations' experiences of those same factors just disappear, leaving biology alone in its place. And it's hard to do effective political action to fix those factors when they aren't clearly acknowledged by medicine in the first place. It's seemingly depoliticized, while at the same time allowing for the current political reality to continue unchallenged. This is the core of an anti-politics machine, something that makes the political goals and effects of a particular approach difficult, if not impossible, to discuss as such. And this is why anthropologists, myself included, tend to consider medicalization as a negative phenomenon. Not just because it converts social issues into individualized medical ones in a way that's not always appropriate, but because in doing so, it disguises the intensely social and political nature of these issues and makes political action on them more difficult. It hides better solutions. And while I could end the episode there, that would be a bit unfair to medicalization, not to mention I haven't even mentioned gender-affirming healthcare yet, so briefly, let's do that. First things first, if you listen to the pilot episode of this podcast, you know that I've already talked at length about both gatekeeper models to gender-affirming care and informed consent models. Both are medicalized models. The gatekeeper model most strongly resembles the interactional level. The doctor is the final authority and arbiter of a treatment that is explicitly medical in nature. The informed consent model, on the other hand, most resembles that new level I introduced, economical. In that, while the doctor is important and provides access to medical treatment, it is the patient who is treated as an authority on the medical issue at hand. Not to mention that insurance coverage is a more significant factor than the doctor in deciding if the issue is considered a medical one at all. There are pros and cons to each model, which I'm not going to rehash here, although I will restate that I think the informed consent model holds the most promise for equitable and respectful gender-affirming care at this time. I bring them up because while both are cases where the negative aspects of medicalization are easy to spot, again, see the pilot episode, the benefits are also significant. One of the most common ways that gender-affirming care is defended in public is by emphasizing its status as healthcare. Because it's healthcare, the argument goes, it's the domain of doctors and medical professionals, not politicians. In other words, politicians have no right to create laws opposing the scientifically backed guidelines for gender-affirming care supported by the vast majority of doctors and major medical organizations. Now, this is a really interesting use of medicalization as an anti-politics machine. Anti-politics machines are always deployed to disguise the political nature of something, and, make no mistake, trans people and their right to exist is unfortunately very political. But normally, the anti-politics machine is an overtly negative thing. It's used by governments and corporations to serve political and economic interests that already exist that don't have normal people's best interests at heart. But in this case, it's almost the opposite. I say almost because as a rhetoric strategy, the medical argument appeals to existing ideals about the role of government in society. In America, for example, many people think that the government should stay out of things, just like things in general, as much as possible. Small government for them is the goal, and framing transitioning as a medical issue is effective precisely because it appeals to the existing sense that the government has no place meddling in healthcare, especially against the explicit recommendations of professionals. And yet, unlike other anti politics machine, this one is being deployed by people to protect their rights from the government. Obviously, this rhetoric won't win over everyone. The people who've convinced themselves of a grand satanic conspiracy on the part of doctors, pharmaceutical companies, and trans people aren't going to be convinced by this. But they're a loud minority, and there are more important people to focus on convincing here. So, while I might personally criticize understanding transitioning as a medical issue, I also understand that defending the right to transition and exist as a trans person requires effective rhetoric. And in this case, that seems to be medicalization. Maybe one day when we aren't in a state of crisis, we can have a more nuanced public discussion about what it means to be trans or transition in the context of Western medicine. That is sort of the whole point of my research, after all. But until then, we've got a more important fight to win. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Anthed Up. Today I walked you through the basics of medicalization and gave a few examples of it in action. I focused on the ways that medicalization acts as an anti-politics machine, turning things that might be understood as social issues into medical ones in a way that hides their political nature. At the same time, I tried to draw attention to the ways in which this apparent depoliticizing can be very helpful in both political efforts and in improving the health of people. I hope you all enjoyed the episode. I'm not sure what the next one's going to be about. It'll probably depend on the next few things I read. I might do something about economics and prosumerism as it relates to DIY activities, since I've already done some of the research on that. I also know that these words mean nothing to people who haven't done that reading, but if I make the episode, they will make sense. Sorry if I sounded weird. I'm a little congested and I couldn't make it go away. I also had to completely redo my microphone settings, so I don't think I fully filtered out all background noises, but, I'm just glad I was able to get this recorded. In any case, thanks for listening. All sources can be found at the link in the description, and you can find me on Twitter, for as long as it continues to exist, at S+B². Have a good rest of your day, be kind to one another, and remember to Anthed Up.